the link will be clearer on the next slide. I know
It
it's a
will
little,
be?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can say it out loud. I made it so that it's pretty easy to find. So with that, we can probably get started. Thank you guys for coming. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm a little sick, so sorry, it's a little sinusy. You know, it's day 2 after lunch, so we really appreciate you coming and spending some time with us to talk about UDL, assistive technology, and student engagement. So I'm Callie Ziltz. I'm a full-time doc student at Lehigh University in teaching, learning, and technology. I have a master's in instructional technology, but my background is actually computer science education. So I fancy myself an instructional designer and instructor by trade. And then this is my colleague, John.
Hi, I'm John Tigerson. I'm also in the PhD program with Callie, and I have a master's in instructional technology. I'm also an IT manager at Drexel University.
So John and I have kind of teamed up our love of all things tech and talking about specifically accessibility and student engagement and how technology and instructional design can kind of help support those concepts. So if you can't see the link at the top of the screen, the URL to these slides is actually bit.ly/UDL_and_AT. So we made that so you guys can find this. We have some resources in the slides, some videos and everything. So just so you know, what we want to cover today is kind of just, yeah?
It says the request action.
Oh, okay. Oh, let me change that really quickly. So, sorry. It's always one thing you forget. So you should be able to view it now. Someone can give me a thumbs up that it worked if you're trying. Okay. All right, great. So what we're going to talk about today is engagement, really in any classroom. What does it mean? It's kind of a big buzzword. Talking about accessibility, how it factors in with engagement, why you should consider it and be mindful of it. And then kind of diving into our 2 areas of expertise, mine being universal design for learning and how you can use it to not only encourage accessibility, but hopefully encourage and promote engagement and student interest and motivation. And then kind of in conjunction with UDL, talking about assistive technology. So that'll be John's piece. And I'll dive into some specific tools. And if there's time at the end, we're happy to have a discussion. I know it's kind of hard to talk broadly about these concepts because it really does have to do with who's in your classroom and what you're designing for. But we'll try to be as general as possible. So I just wanted to highlight this quote at the beginning. It's talking about how motivation kind of comes from 2 aspects, student engagement comes from 2 aspects, motivation and active learning. And the active learning piece I think is really important because, you know, if things are not created accessibly, if all students in your class can't participate and be active in that process, you know, then those students are kind of at an unfair advantage and their engagement might reflect that. So that's kind of where our thought was and where our mission is today to talk about, you know, how we can address engagement by promoting motivation and active learning. So the problem with engagement, I have the dictionary definition up there. I think we all use it kind of interchangeably with words like motivation, interest, you know, curiosity. It's a really complex concept, and it's kind of one of those things that, especially as an instructor, you know it when you see it, and you know it when you don't see it. So if you want to go to the next slide. You know, I kind of put some of the pictures, the classic ones of just the elbow up on the table. Luckily, no one's doing that. I was fully prepared to call someone out if necessary. But you know, it's a little daunting as an instructor to see this and want to engage students and understand, you know, what are you interested in and how can I bring you to the table here? But if they're not engaged, then that's really hard to do. So as I said before, you know what it is. It's a really complex concept. It's super personal and super situational. So myself, I am like type A overachiever, but there's still some situations where I walk into a classroom and I shut down and I'm not engaged at all, even though kind of intrinsically, like, I want to be in school. But it still has a lot to do with what's happening in the classroom, what's happening around me, what's my environment like, things like that. Kind of just touched on this, but engagement is, can you actually go back? Yeah. Engagement is, influenced by a variety of factors. It's not just what's happening in the classroom in that moment. I focus a lot and teach a lot with higher education, so undergraduate students. And if anyone is in higher ed, like, they don't just stop, and leave their baggage at the door. They bring in all the social problems, all the emotional issues, anything that's happening. There's always a choice of what could I be doing instead of going to this class, and kind of needing to bring students and get them engaged and have them interested from the get-go, and kind of sustain that interest. So what student engagement is not is limited to a certain demographic of students. I'm sure studies have been done to show that certain groups of students are less engaged or more engaged than others, when it comes to certain fields, but engagement is something that is so personal that I don't think you can make that generalization. And kind of going along with that, it's not only a consideration for in-person formal learning. So the first time John and I actually presented on this topic, we focused on distance education, which distance online education can include a variety of types of students. If you start talking about, older than 18, you're actually talking about adults and how do adults learn rather than how do students learn. And so there's just a whole kind of, it's something to be considered for any learning environment, whether it's informal, whether it's online or in person. So that's just kind of our disclaimer. And what it's not is guaranteed ever. You think that sometimes you create the best instructional activities, best worksheet, and you think it's going to get the job done, and then you walk into class and it's just, blowing up in your face a little bit. And that's just because of, what's happening on that day and what are all of the things that are impacting students. So that's what we're going to try to address here. So if you've ever done a quick Google search for, increasing student engagement, you're wondering how to do it. There's so many different pages. The tech nerd in me has a little link that's going to actually show someone Googling how to do this. There we go. So how to increase student engagement. It comes up with those pages of like 10 ways to do it and 15 like proven ways to increase engagement. But until you get in your class with your students and you start understanding who they are as an audience and who they are as learners, there's no way to just take all of this in and apply. There's like definitely some general concepts, but we're going to try to talk about specific ways, that you can understand your learners and address their engagement. So then kind of tying into that is the idea of accessibility, and this is where kind of John will pick up. Oh, actually I was going to talk about this. Have any of you seen this image before? It's like a kind of a staple in education, but just talking about accessibility and universal design doesn't always mean giving everyone the same thing, but giving them the tools they need to succeed. So, whether it's captions or extended time on a test or whatever, a modification is, if that's what the student needs to kind of help get them to this table and get them to the same point as everyone else, then that's kind of what we're talking about.
So why does accessibility matter, and why do we need to pay so close attention to it? And there's a couple reasons. First, it's the law. The government helped us with this with the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and later the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this was intended to address employment of people with disabilities. Section 504 talks about discrimination against those people, and it includes any programs that are receiving federal assistance. So it includes certainly education, but it also includes businesses who are trying to get grants from the government. That's also a major consideration. Section 508 specifically covers the use of electronic and information technology, and it requires information to be provided in multiple ways. So the consumers of the information aren't relying on only one sense. And as it turns out, that legislation, the same legislation, was used to provide access to education for people with disabilities. And so what we're taking away from this education is that, or from this these government regulations, is that students have to be provided with access to the same amount of information in the same time frame as students without those disabilities. And another reason is that it's the right thing to do. According to the World Health Organization, 15% of the world's population has a disability. That's over 1 billion people. And 20% of those people have a serious disability. And we know that it's more difficult for people with disabilities to get an education. So guess what? A lot of them don't get an education, or they just barely get enough, or they're pushed through the system to get out. And what does that lead to? The outcomes for people with disabilities demonstrate poorer health outcomes, higher poverty rates, higher unemployment, and employment at a lower level when they can find employment. So improving the accessibility to this education is very important, and it's why this matters so much. So what happens if we don't effectively provide those services? Well, the aggrieved party can file a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights, and recently in 2018 they expanded their ruling, or they went back to an older ruling that allowed appeals. So there was a large increase of appeals, and it expanded, opened up some older cases too. And then, of course, we're in America, so lawsuits. In 2018, Section 508 was made a little more detailed as to what providers of information have to provide. So lawsuits shot up. So there were over 2,200 lawsuits filed in 2018. And some of those were involving major universities. UC Berkeley, they were sued because they didn't have accessible textbooks, or they didn't have accommodations processes in place. MIT and Harvard created the MOOC edX, and they were sued because they didn't have closed captioning on a lot of their websites, and they didn't have speed control on a lot of their websites, which matters for people who are blind. If they can listen to it, they can listen at a faster rate than those of us with sight can. People sometimes want to slow it down if they have problems with cognitive issues. So they were sued. That was recently in December. It was just settled. MIT and Harvard are going to go back to the beginning of January 2019 and update everything they've put out since then and moving forward with correct closed captioning. So that's going to be a big deal. Penn State was also sued because they had a lot of their websites that weren't accessible. And there are others, and certainly more are coming. So how do we prevent this from happening to you or to your school? In the K-12 setting, schools have to have a 504 coordinator. Notification has to be sent out annually, notifying the consumers at that school who the coordinator is. There has to be a grievance process in place for that. And this doesn't have to be particularly burdensome for the school, because it can mirror other grievance processes that are already in place at your school. So you can almost cut and paste, but there has to be one in place. In higher education, there is no 504 plan, but you have to have someone to perform similar duties, because you have to meet the requirements of the student with disabilities. So the assistant technologist would take those duties. If you're designing for or creating a non-traditional program or learning environments, be your own accessibility coordinator. Design it with accessibility in mind for the consuming, the student or anyone else at your institution who is going to be using this information.
And again, like even if you're not in necessarily a non-traditional program or more of an informal learning environment, doing this early is going to is going to help you not have to make changes after the fact. So if you create activities and design instruction thinking about accessibility in mind, looking for videos that have closed captioning, making sure you know, create PDFs so that they're readable by a screen reader, then that's going to be less kind of like backtracking you have to do when you do get notice that maybe a student has an accommodation that they need for some documented disability. And this is kind of where universal design for learning comes in. So universal design for learning isn't focused specifically on accessibility, but it kind of goes hand in hand, and I'll explain why or how in a second. Has anyone ever seen this little cartoon? I feel like I can't talk about UDL without showing it. And if you can't see, I know it's kind of hard to see from the back, but it just says clearing the path for people with special needs clears the path for everyone. So if the man shoveling the stairs would have shoveled the ramp, everyone could go up the ramp. But because he only shoveled the stairs, only a certain number of students could go up the stairs, and there's still one who's, you know, waiting to use the ramp. And I think this is kind of the idea of, if you create universally designed instruction and provide opportunities for students where everyone can be engaged, then, you know, you'll bring everyone to the table, and maybe even, you know, engage those who haven't been particularly motivated or have felt, you know, left out in previous classrooms. So kind of like the Rehabilitation Act and the legislation around accessibility, universal design started talking about physical space. So it was an architecture design principle to just make sure that everyone can use a certain physical space. So, you know, looking at like the design of this classroom, we're taking into account the fact that there's rows, and yeah, I can't walk straight back and talk to every single person without having to walk around. So if I was in a wheelchair, this would not be the ideal space for me. It's been kind of adapted as a framework for instructional design and for learning specifically, to create, you know, materials and content and deliver content in a way that can accommodate all types of learners, whether they have a disability or not, whether it's documented or not. You know, just seeing your learners as a whole person and understanding that, you know, being able to play a video at half speed is helpful even if you don't have any sort of disability that might require it. So this is something that we use a lot in instructional design, and especially in our classes, and it's called an empathy map. And what it is a way to really understand your learners. So, you know, even if, so like for example, I would look at this map and I would channel what I know about undergraduate students. And so looking at the things they you know, think and feel, it's gonna be, you know, a lot of different stuff about being independent now and having to manage your own time, and that's a really stressful thing, where in a K through 12 school, time management during the day might not be as big of an issue, because, you know, there's less independence and more structure for the students. This is a really nice way to kind of understand who your students are as people and like what they're bringing into the classroom with them, so you can understand how to best design instruction. So there's 3 kind of overarching guidelines for UDL, and they're all based on the science of how people learn. So we've talked, I mean, you talk about effective learning, understanding the why, getting students engaged and keeping them engaged throughout the process, looking at the what, which is more of, you know, what is the content to be consumed, what are they there to do, and how you're gonna disseminate instruction, and how they're gonna interact with the material. And so the main idea, if like you boil UDL down to just like the really important bits, is that you're designing instruction to provide multiple interactions and experiences for each network. So not only can you provide multiple experiences for why you would care about this, or why it should be interesting to you, or why, you know, you should be engaged, but also different ways to provide the actual instruction, and different ways for students to actually create their own knowledge and share what they've learned. So the first network, as I said before, is the why of learning. So looking at, you know, engagement specifically, as we've kind of been talking about throughout this. And so what this is going to include is, as I said, you know, creating opportunities to promote interest, making it different. I know it's easy to get into a routine of different activities, but even switching them up so slightly, you know, to just try to entice students in different ways and introduce them to different concepts. And also fostering collaboration and maybe taking time to explain what a good collaborator looks like. This is something that I've done with my undergrad computer science students because they've gotten to freshman year of college and really don't know how to collaborate well. So we take a whole day or a whole class to just talk about, what does it mean to be a good collaborator? What does collaboration look like and things like that. And then if we go to the next. So then the next network is this recognition network. So looking at the what. So what is the content that students are actually interacting with? And so that's going to be anything that, if you're using anything super content specific, vocab, syntax. If you're in a science and you have like a formula written out, there are ways that can be done using LaTeX and different tools so that screen readers can interpret them. Because those are things you don't really think about sometimes, but if you put in a super specific scientific term or like a formula for gravity or whatever it is, the screen reader can't make meaning of that for you. What it can do for the students who are using it is just literally tell them what's on the screen. So you have to be very clear when you're creating content to kind of keep that in mind. Using different ways to engage with content. So if it's always reading and filling out a worksheet, that gets a little tiresome and students aren't kind of engaged by that. But if you switch it up and maybe there's videos and reading this week, and next week we're going to look at pictures and we're going to discuss them or whatever it is, giving multiple ways of interacting with content is also going to help for different types of learners. So if I'm more of a text-based person and I can read that and make meaning of it right away, great. If the visual learning is more important for me or more intriguing for me, that also works. So having those options kind of allows the students to make meaning for themselves. And then obviously, talking about prior background knowledge and making connections to other content. These are all like basic kind of educational concepts, but just presenting it in a different way to say, is there different ways we can do this or multiple ways you can do it, because not every student is going to learn the same way. And then looking at the how of learning, and the biggest part of this is not only how students are interacting with that information, which is kind of what I just described, but also what they're creating, giving them options in, you can either create a 3-page or a trifold pamphlet to describe this process, or you can make a presentation, or you can write a paper, anything like that. Giving them options of ways to express themselves is also going to be really important and support that engagement piece as well. So then these are kind of our steps to apply UDL in a perfect world, when you just sit down and just make all your instructional activities and it happens so clearly. I realize things don't happen like that in the world, but these are kind of just still the keys to keep in mind. So first, focusing on your content before the design. That sometimes it's easy to get ahead of ourselves. Oh, I'll make an activity that's this. But take a step back and talk about, what do you actually want the students to learn? Who are the students in your classroom? Working through that empathy map to really understand them. As this applies, if you're in a K-12 setting, of course, you might not have a course syllabus, but just talking about accommodations, something new that I've done in my own classroom is actually went in on the first day of classes and mentioned accessibility to them, and I said, if anyone has any accommodations, documented or not, please talk to me, because I want to set everyone up for success. You're not lowering the bar, you're not changing their assessments, you're not making it any less rigorous, but you're just making sure that everyone has what they need to succeed. So third, just creating accessible everything. When you start creating worksheets and documents and PowerPoints, whatever the tool is that you're using, just keep accessibility in mind. John's going to go over some tools about how you can test websites to make sure the color contrast is okay. Because sometimes even if you have perfect eyesight, it's really hard to see the colors on a screen if the contrast isn't right. And actually the first version of this PowerPoint that we had was terrible, so we did change that so that we could at least abide by our own rules here. As I said before, provide multiple and alternative ways to consume media, so not just focusing or leveraging just a textbook or just videos, but kind of mixing it up and giving alternatives. John will talk more about this, but tagging images with alt text and making sure this one's super important. Making sure you test your worksheets, applications, whatever it is, just test it on different devices, because if you have a student who at home doesn't have a laptop, It's important to know what does it look like on a cell phone if they're going to try to use a cell phone to kind of complete an activity. And so that's really helpful. And even if you don't know have the technical skills on how to fix that, there's people in your schools that are there to support you for that. And you can go to them and say, you know, I want to make sure this is the most accessible version of whatever it is that it can be. Also, accessible communications, especially when you're emailing or messaging students. I know a lot of like LMS platforms have like messaging capability, but just keeping accessibility in mind when you're messaging as well. You throw in a funny picture, and if it's just like a meme to describe, I don't know, something that happened in the classroom, you know, including an alt tag so that all students could be engaged and aware of what's going on. And then be flexible. Again, that's just with all instruction. Nothing ever truly goes as planned. So just being flexible and understanding that even if it's not the most accessible or most universally designed version of an activity, it's a start, and everything you can do is iterative, and you're constantly thinking about that.
So assistive technology is any item that increases or maintains, improves the capabilities for people with disabilities. And this can be equipment, it can be software, it can be hardware. So ideally, your school would have an assistive technologist or someone acting in that capacity. Teachers generally can't manage everything, so a lot of that burden should be taken up by the assistive technologist to help manage those processes for them. And the assistive technologist should have relevant exposure to support any technology that your students, teachers at your school are using. That doesn't mean you should know about every technology out there. It's nice to stay on top of things, but you don't have to go to quite that detail. And understanding the technology, it could be as simple as discovering how to do things on your own, or it could be as involved in attending formal training for the technology you're using. That being said, if you're going to want to use a technology that's that complicated, you have to make sure you can still turn that into a good experience for your students. Just making sure it's not too complicated. So what are some common technology accessibility problems? A big one, video controls on videos, or controls on videos, closed captioning. Those are two big ones, and I mentioned the lawsuits earlier. You should be able to control speed, pause, rewind, fast forward. Closed captioning should match. There are a lot of applications out there that can close caption for you. YouTube has their own. They are pretty good, but they're not perfect. So you have to be careful when you're using those. Documents that aren't posted in an accessible format. If you're using a PDF, make sure it's not saved as an image. Make sure it's saved as OCR. That's optical character recognition. And it sets up the PDF so that it can be read by screen readers. Also, when you're developing documents, particularly in a PDF format, when they can be broken up into different chunks, make sure the reading process flows correctly. That's a big deal. A lot goes into this, so it's got to be in the right order. Another issue is problems with tables. They don't always look right when you change formats of documents. They're hard to describe when it's being read by a screen reader. Make sure there's descriptions with those as well. Poor contrast with foreground and background. We saw that actually in the first slide that we had, our title page. It was dark text in the upper right, our address for our presentation, but it was sort of commingled with other dark background, so it was difficult to read. But the most common is probably a lack of alt text on images, and if that's the case, a screen reader will just describe it as picture, and it doesn't help the people digesting this information, let them know what it is. So the web content accessibility guidelines address vision, speech, hearing, mobility, and it's a series of recommendations to make your web content more accessible to the consumer. I have here a couple web checkers where you can go to these and you can put in a website and it'll tell you if it passes. If it doesn't, it'll tell you where you're having issues, which is nice. Accessibility compliance. I've had some good success with that first one, the W3.org. This is a color contrast tool that would have picked up our first slide for sure. Even the yellow text up here, if that were a little bit lighter, that would probably not pass because it would blend in too much with the white background. There are also institution-specific resources and guidelines out there. I work at Drexel University, and we have specific colors that we use, our Drexel colors. We have our own logos that we have to use, and we had, probably a couple years ago now, we had consultants come in to go through websites and courses and all kinds of different documents to identify any issues that we've had. So Drexel spent a lot of money to make sure that we were compliant with this. So some physical assistive technology tools. A lot of these you've probably seen before. Wheelchairs, certainly, magnifying glass. Hearing aids are considered an AT tool. Light switches, doors, specialized keyboards, and squeeze machines. Does anyone know what squeeze machines are? Or hug box? So Temple Grandin is, she is pretty famous because she is probably the most successful person with autism out there. She was really well supported by her parents, and she was born back in the 40s. So she had autism and a lot of differences from her other students that were evident early on, but her parents got her a lot of specialized education and supported her. She ended up with a PhD and as a professor at Colorado State University. She invented a squeeze machine or a hug box because she saw on her grandparents' farm a cow getting inoculated. So they put it in this chute and compressed these claws around it, not sharp claws, but just to help contain it, and they relaxed while they were inoculated. So she created a machine that uses hydraulics to surround a person who's using it and sort of squeeze gently. And this really helps reduce stress for people with hypersensitivity issues, and a lot of autistic people are hypersensitive. So she invented the squeeze machine or the hug box. So we'll move on to some cognitive assistive technology tools. So Talk Rocket Go is designed to assist students with social problems, emotional disorders, autism, or ADHD. So it's customizable. It allows you to plug in words and phrases to speak for the user. So it's also it has GPS capability. So if you could plug in classmates' names, and they would be readily accessible when you're at your school. Or if you have to go to the pharmacy, you could plug in some words and phrases or sentences, asking for a prescription or a medication or something like that. So that's helpful because it helps people who can't talk interact. It also it's Bluetooth accessible, and it has interfaces with wheelchairs, which is nice. And then the next one we have here is the Social Express. And this one helps autistic students to learn how to interact with other people by that they would plug in their feelings, and if they were angry, they would plug that in, and it would provide some guidance for them, reminding them to keep negative thoughts in my head and not just spout off whatever they were thinking at the time. So it helps with critical thinking. It helps with nonverbal communication. And the next two, the first one here is from it's a game-based application called Attentive Mind, and it's for students with ADHD, and it helps them with executive function and cognitive skills. I'm going to play a video, and it's pretty impressive because it has it's got a headset, and it works on brainwaves or electrical impulses to help guide them within the game. It's pretty incredible.
Right up through their late teens. All of them have the same essential difficulties, and that is listening, paying attention, initiating and completing tasks, ignoring distractions, and controlling their impulses. When it comes to improving attention, the conversation always includes adequate sleep, eating well, exercising, and optimizing daily routines. Until now, these have been the variables within our control. Recent advances in neuroimaging, along with a new understanding of brain development, however, have changed the conversation. In order for children to learn, they have to pay attention and control their impulses. For many, however, attention is an acquired skill. In fact, it's many skills. Attentive Mind is the first series of games designed to build the cognitive skills necessary for attention control. Because attention is a puzzle with several pieces, it took a completely new way of thinking to put them all together in a way for anyone to rapidly develop their focus and inhibit impulses. Attentive Mind shifts the paradigm of learning games by allowing players to control the speed of action with their brain waves. Through sensors in the headset, brain electrical activity is quantified. The more focused the player's mind, the faster they run. When distractions intrude, progress slows or comes to a halt. When children experience this new sensation, their expressions of pleasant surprise reveal how this newly discovered power of attention control feels. Combining focus with challenges designed to develop specific skills like selective attention, impulse inhibition, multitasking, and self-regulation, the player adds swipes and taps on the tablet to navigate and strategize. This entirely new way to play is fun, engaging, and inherently rewarding. Focus Forward technology uses potential focus goals to lead players toward increasing levels of skill and ability. The brain's capacity for change results in the creation of new connections and attention circuits, while reinforcing and accelerating impulse control. Attentive Mind is your child's personal attention trainer. It provides the exercises necessary to build strong focus and cognitive control, coaching and encouraging with virtual mentors, helping to transfer their skills to the classroom, living room, and playroom. The conversation has changed. The future of attention is now.
So pretty cool. The next one is from Keeley, and they're billing themselves as digital medicine. It uses sensory and motor skills to target specific parts of the brain, and they're developing other uses for autism and major depressive disorder. And they actually have done studies on this. They actually put out a paper in the Lancet that came out just yesterday. I didn't get to review it, but there were favorable results when people were using this product as over their general drug therapies. So there, you can see they're using it for ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and major depressive disorder. The ADHD one is much more advanced. They have a little more into it. And there are plenty of other apps as well, so keep your eyes out for them. And at this point, I think we're done.
Questions?
What, just generally speaking, who here is an instructor or teacher? And who is in on the IT side, assistant technologist? Okay.
So as an instructional technologist, have you guys been talking a lot about accessibility?
Well, it's more website compliance. We're interested in kind of finding resources to, we have 560 students in our entire district, K-12, so we don't have the resources you mentioned.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of amusing because that's me. And I don't know how to find the time to do it, and I don't know how to find the resources to support it. So, I mean, if they were to come after us, we would just, I would presume, have to just pull the plug on any videos that we create. We would create videos.
Are instructors creating a lot of videos or like finding them elsewhere? And
Well, we
using
have
them?
like some student-based or instructor-based videos, but we also have a digital publishing class where the students create videos and content for YouTube.
Yeah.
As part of their classwork, and we've tried to encourage the kids to incorporate that, because if they're looking at careers in that field, then they need to be compliant.
Yeah.
It's student-led projects, and they'll take an app before they're going to take on a whole everything play-by-play on YouTube.
And like John mentioned, a lot of tools. So like I'm also interning at another college this semester, and they have a video resource where you can order captions, and they're generated by a machine. And they're not great. They pick up on everything, and they think every and every part of it is like super important and pivotal. But it's a good place to start, and then work backwards and like edit those captions. But yeah, it's an interesting perspective of like the student side of student creation and thinking about accessibility as well.
Even like an hour-long lecture for a teacher to sit down and go back through that, that's going to take an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Plus the hour it took to make the lecture, so.
And it probably took more like 6 hours to make the lecture. Because once you start talking, at least for me, I start saying weird things, and then I have to like cut it and then start over. Yeah. It's definitely a timely process. Yeah.
I'm actually the accessible technology coordinator for community college.
Oh yeah.
So obviously that's exactly one of the reasons why the tiered approach. So for example, if it's like content that's used like multiple times, students are able to use that first. Stuff that's like one-offs usually hasn't worked unless there is an accommodation. So that's why they do that.
Okay.
From a risk management perspective.
They kind of like schedule it out, and like the most used resources are those. Yeah. Yeah, and that's why when you're thinking about it now moving forward, kind of how like MIT and Harvard with their edX thing, it's like they have to go back and retroactively do it, but keep it in mind moving forward too. Like I script myself when I create videos, so a lot of times like you might have something typed up anyways, and like to do that and the captions maybe right after, it's still time, but it's less time than having to go back and rewatch the entire thing. So yeah.
Because I'm the librarian, I'm sitting here as a technology coach thinking, oh, I'll come in and sit on this session, but maybe I'll find some new tools that'll help somebody who wanted to teach my building. But as I sit here and think about what you're talking about, I'm thinking about all the teachers now in my building who create content and share it on their class website and things like that. I mean, do they need to be concerned? Like, that's why I'm like, I mean, it's a regular classroom teacher just going,
So,
this is our school resource.
From my perspective, and again, like I'm not in K-12 education, I think it's an issue when you do have someone, when you need to make the modification or the accommodation for someone.
So
in general, it's
we
just
have a student with a 504 if they have a student with a 504 in their classroom and they're posting assignments onto their class website, it needs to follow.
depending on what that student needs. If they were, for example, using a screen reader to read all of their documents, then every document that student reads needs to be able to be kind of, I don't even know how to interpreted almost
so
by.
it's based on the students who are sitting in their classroom, not necessarily anybody who might just happen to.
I think so. Yeah, it's not like you have to expect every edge situation.
So like
That's a
the
little
difference
overwhelming.
between, so like in a high school, you fall under IDEA and not ADA. So IDEA is for success. So like you're looking individually for success of that student with a 504 plan or an IEP plan. So it's not generalized to all students for success. It's just isolated in those situations. So like at my high school, we had a situation where we had a kid who needed audio text, and the teacher freaked out that she didn't have the link to it for all of her classes. I was trying to purchase all these licenses for each section of her classroom. We're like, no,
just that one
this
class.
one kid using one login and it's good to go. So it's very individualized at the high school and lower.
And it's important that to note that there are differences for internally used documents as compared to universities, which put things out there for everyone to read. There was a blind guy who sued 50 different universities because he couldn't access their websites. He wasn't going to the schools there. He just sued them because and that was one of the criticisms with this update to Section 508 is that it allows people to monetize this stuff. So he was suing, and there are serial abusers of this who just go out and this guy had no interest in any of these schools. He was just doing this to try to get money from them, and that's sort of bad form. It was from a what?
College fair.
College fair? Is that so? He gathered information from a college fair.
Wow. Did he win that lawsuit?
He won something.
Okay. So they settled or something.
But the main idea was that they were going to fix their websites by X date. I don't know. I didn't follow up that afterwards.
And yeah, like a lot of the technology specific things that John mentioned as far as like, contrast and making sure your video players have, you can control the speed, like that might not be something that you as a librarian or a classroom instructor can be like cognizant of or make any changes to, but it's a conversation that's constantly happening between instructional technologists, accessibility groups and everyone in general. And I think the idea with universal design is just be thinking about it. So even if you're not doing you'll never be able to make the most accessible version of anything, but just be cognizant of it. And I think that like even having that mindset, the students see it and it makes them feel more at ease when they can have a conversation about it. So our slides have a list of resources as well for you guys to kind of check out if there's any websites you want to play around with to see how accessible they are. Our contact information is also up there. And we're not technically here to plug Lehigh, but our professor asked us to. So we have some information about some of Lehigh's master's and PhD programs. They're in person, online, and hybrid courses as well. So
Thank you.
that's all we have. Thank you. working groups on accessibility, because it's kind of a big push for them right now to make sure.
I've used and managed assistive technologies. We're responsible for shipping, need, we're responsible for purchase of, support, training on these items. So we have one or two students who are extremely weird. Others use dictation. So it's interesting.
Who's the accessibility coordinator? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Information communication. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Yeah. That's very well fixed that. Just for reference too, like this college that I'm working at right now, their accessibility coordinator was until last year called disability coordinator. Yeah, yeah. So it's kind of like a big push right now, because I think they're dealing with some legislation and yeah. But thank you for that.
Good job. For the UDL, you might want to help drive them home those capturing on your screen by your presentation.
Yeah.
And then using the microphone.
That would definitely, yeah.
You guys projected fine.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank
Like
you.
enough drives then.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're doing what we're saying. Thank you. Yeah.